Good afternoon. My name is Tom Glaisyer, and I'd like to welcome you to the New America Foundation to what I expect will be a fascinating discussion about New Zealand's plan to bring high-speed fibre internet to its citizens. For those of you watching on the web, New America is a public policy institute that looks to the next generation of challenges facing the United States. It's a mission we embrace through 15 programs that cover everything from counterterrorism to education and economic growth, both here in DC and in California. I lead our work here in media policy as part of the Open Technology Initiative team, a team of lawyers, technologists, and field staff and policy analysts based both here and around the country. As a team, we aim to formulate policy and regulatory reforms to support open architectures and open source innovations, and to facilitate the development and implementation of open technologies and communication networks. We've done a lot of work promoting affordable, universal and ubiquitous communications networks and broadband through partnerships with communities, researchers, industry and the public interest groups. And behind this really lies a commitment to maximizing the potentials of these technologies by studying their social and economic impacts, particularly for poor, rural and other underserved constituencies. Now, the event today is titled Kiwi Connected. And though we are called the New America Foundation, given this is the third event in the year with participation from New Zealand, perhaps we should consider changing our organization's name. That said, this is the first one where the New Zealander has been able to attend in person, and we thank Graham Mitchell for taking the, as I know, very long flight. We've taken a particular interest in national plans by other countries, and we'd like to see today what lessons New Zealanders have learned in getting this program off the ground and seeing perhaps if there's any applicability over here. New Zealand's ultra-fast broadband initiative will bring 100 megabits per second download to 3/4 of the population, while an associated rural program takes aim at bringing high-speed internet to rural homes and schools. Now, these goals in terms of speed pretty much echo what's been laid out in our national broadband plan. But unlike the US, the New Zealand government is investing 1.5 billion New Zealand dollars, I think, in total, to use that investment to sell wholesale access to the fibre that's built out, with the aim of creating a competitive retail market like we see in other countries. Now, in equivalent GDP terms, this would have required, and I think of Blair, if he was to be in the shoes of someone recommending such a plan in the US, if we think about per capita or GDP equivalent investments of somewhere between $95 and $132 billion of investment, if you were to think of this in US terms, this is a significant and very meaningful investment the government is making. And we have to remember that this is coming from a government really, I think in US terms would be considered central right, and a Prime Minister who is a former banker at Merrill Lynch. So I think there's some interesting questions here as to that we can explore as to why we've gone down the path and how we think it will develop. Now, to introduce us to the New Zealand Broadband Plan, we have none other than the CEO of Crown Fibre Holdings, Graham Mitchell. He will begin the event with a short presentation and share his perspective on the UFB and explain Crown Fibre Holdings and how it all fits together. This is a complicated plan, or somewhat complicated plan, that needs a little introduction. Now, subsequently, we'll move to a roundtable discussion where I will moderate and be joined by Joanne Hovis, Ben Lennett, and Blair Levin. Now, I know the audience has a range of perspectives on this and some significant questions, and I look forward to bringing those in during a Q&A. Last piece of housekeeping before we start, I should mention this is being live streamed on the web, hence the comprehensive introduction. And everything is on the record, as I say, forever, or at least as long as Google or WikiLeaks can find it. Now, for those of you on Twitter, please use the hashtag #NAFevent to ask questions during the panel and Q&A, and we'll endeavour to incorporate those questions. During the Q&A, please wait for the microphone, otherwise the web audience will not hear the question. And so without further ado, I will invite Graham to the stage to begin the presentation. Please, Graham. And the
Right, thank you for that. I hope most of you will be able to follow my accent. It's not. I'll try and roll my R's as much as I can. Just a quick bit of background. Crown Fibre Holdings Limited. Everything New Zealand and the central government we call a crown. It's a vestige from our colonial days, which we no longer really have. So Crown Fibre Holdings is actually a limited liability company set up by the New Zealand government. It's actually an investment company, and it has a full commercial board of directors. So for example, our chairman is the ex-chairman of the New Zealand Stock Exchange. So it operates at reasonable arm's length from the government, and all the executives are actually from the private sector. So we're a little bit unusual in government circles in that regard. So today I'll just cover a few points here, where we sit in global rankings, policy issues, policy solutions, UFB initiative, bid on product and pricing, take-up drivers, and also where we actually see our rural initiative and our summary as well. That's just a few snapshots our tourism people wanted me to show you to encourage you to come down and spend your US dollars in New Zealand, which don't go quite as far as they used to. Rankings in OECD, we're not too far behind the US in relation to penetration. We used to be a little bit further back. The good news for us is we're actually ahead of Australia, who's our major rival in the region. It's a bit like Canada being ahead of the US, which in actual fact it is, on this chart here. Akamai, we do look at this quite a lot to sort of give an idea of broadband speeds. There's a debate about what broadband speeds are like in any economy, but Akamai do consistently measure across the countries there. You can see on the far left there the fibre-rich countries, particularly Korea, Hong Kong, obviously heavily apartment dwelling type nations there in Japan. Netherlands there is coming up. That's largely driven by KPN, their incumbent there, who's deploying a lot of fibre. New Zealand's quite a way down the ranking, but it's really sort of a fairly even pack after that. US is around 5 megabits per second, a bit more. We're at about 3.6, again ahead of Australia. So that's one of the focuses that we actually have. The policy drivers, like most central governments in our part of the world, Singapore's embarked on this, Australia's embarked on it, Malaysia's embarked on it. There's a number of countries in our region. Obviously Korea was the first to embark on a government intervention plan in relation to broadband. Focused on really productivity and efficiency in the economy, the belief that you put the core infrastructure in place that will drive productivity benefits in the economy like any central infrastructure in the economy. It's not unusual. The original telecommunication infrastructure in New Zealand was obviously funded from central government, as it was in most countries around the world, with the exception of probably the US, which effectively AT&T, through its franchise arrangements back then, effectively ended up with the same result. A big focus on health and education. There are limited studies that we've actually found, and we're welcome for anybody who actually has studies showing a transition from broadband to ultra-fast broadband or fibre. Most of the studies around are really from dial-up through to ADSL. But there are a few around there that we've managed to find, which see some growth numbers there. Most expect you will get productivity gains through broadband and through fibre, but it's yet really to quantify. The government decided to actually invest now to accelerate investment. We're really looking at a decade perspective here and a 1 year perspective. So really looking at, what will the nation look like in 2020 rather than what the nation will look like in 2012. And also keeping up with key trading partners, people like Singapore and Australia are key trading partners. Japan for us, Korea are all leading trading partners, as well as China. This is a fairly busy slide, so I'll try and go through it quickly. It's quite difficult to explain a complete market structure in a very short slide. So I've really only focused on the fixed market here in New Zealand. It is dominated by Telecom New Zealand, which is publicly listed, vertically integrated incumbent, very much look-alike Verizon, AT&T type business, last mile copper monopoly, mobile business. The interesting thing in New Zealand is we do not have a local access competition in the residential sector. We really do not have MSOs. There's a small fibre HFC operator in Wellington and Christchurch, they're about 5%. Video is delivered predominantly by pay TV direct-to-home satellite owned by News Corp. They're about 60% penetrated in the marketplace. So the interesting thing is here is 90% of the fixed tails are from Telecom New Zealand. They have 50% market share in broadband. So all the other RSPs effectively operate as a CLEC. And the challenge there is you're competing against the incumbent and you're buying all your basically input services from the incumbent. So the government did try to move them to an operational separation model, trying to get greater transparency between their wholesale and their retail business. That has brought with some challenges. There still are some competition issues in the marketplace around that. And when the RSPs actually buy the services, the DSL and the telephony or POTS line resellers at set at retail minus X. That minus X is between 15 to 20%, so it's not a particularly lucrative market there. So that's why you still see the incumbent with a very high broadband market share in the marketplace. We do have unbundled local loop in New Zealand. It's possibly about 60% of exchanges are unbundled. There's about 8% of lines. So the price in New Zealand dollars for the ADSL and the POTS resale product is about 55 New Zealand dollars. That's about 50 US. For the unbundled local loop, it's about $20. So we are seeing a number of RSPs arbitraging into the unbundled local loop and putting their DSLAMs in place. That's limited because there's a fibre to the cabinet program that the incumbents run out, which actually limits the reach of the unbundled local loop. Our enforcement is through the Commerce Commission, who have a similar sort of enforcement role to FCC here. Non-discrimination, competition, all the standard things that you'd expect in a developed regulatory market. But you can see there the shares by the incumbent are very large in the fixed market. So the issues that we really wanted to resolve at a policy level was increase retail intensity, competition intensity at retail, innovation to incent the innovation for the last mile monopoly. So there's no incentive at the moment for the incumbent to invest in the last mile because there is no competition. So they want to sweat the asset. Previous government actually did a fibre to the node intervention where they required by legislation for the incumbent to invest in fibre to the node, but they haven't invested nothing in the last mile for a number of years. We do have fibre in the major metro markets in the CBDs. Lack of widespread open access for last mile fibre even in the metros. Greater separation of retail and wholesale so the service providers don't feel they're buying from their largest competitor. Increasing the value in the service layer and increasing access to ultra-fast broadband. And you can actually see there the unbundled local loop started. It's the blue line at the bottom in New Zealand. Started off and then it sort of plateaued. That's largely due to the fibre to the node program. So the policy response of the government was the ultra-fast broadband initiative. The genesis of this was by the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. They did some analysis on this. They came up with a $1.5 billion initiative they thought that could be assisted to actually develop this with some economic growth numbers, 75% population government, the current population coverage. The current Conservative government was in opposition. They seized on this at the last election and ran it in their campaign and were successful. They got into power and then we had to work out how to actually do it, and we found out we didn't actually have enough money. So the first thing we decided to move on was actually go to a PPP or public-private sector partnership model. And really encourage the private sector to invest. It is a Conservative government, and one of their core election plans was investing in infrastructure. There's a large program on our freeway infrastructure being invested in the nation, rail, and also telecommunication infrastructure being this initiative. Vertical separation, access versus retail. We wanted to also restrict the wholesaler to only layer 1 and layer 2 to put all the value add up into the RSP layer. The initial tender went out at layer 1 only, which was run by the government. This before Crown Fibre Holdings actually existed. The challenge we had there is the costs that came back from the bidders for the network were immense because they were trying to provide dedicated fibre to every single premise to allow for at least 6 service providers. So you had a vast amount of fibre in the ground, a vast amount of civil engineering costs, so it just was not economic. So we had to really move to a layer 2 open access model for the mass market, although we kept dark fibre at a point-to-point level for priority users, such as high-end enterprise, schools, hospitals, etc. The other key aspect there is we want to have a low cost to interconnect. It's one of the key challenges for small RSPs. In the modern broadband world, it's very expensive for them to interconnect. They have to interconnect at various points throughout a city. So we decided to have one point of interconnect per urban centre. So Auckland, which is our largest city, it's about the size of Philadelphia, you actually only need to go to one point of interconnect to reach the whole of the city, which is equivalent to a third of New Zealand's population. So that significantly lowers the cost of entry for an RSP. Open access, non-discrimination, equivalence of input, well, it is actually develops in the plan as well. The other thing, to actually encourage migration to the fibre network, we actually thought we needed to set fibre prices paradoxically below copper, even though it's a superior product. Essentially, to get the RSPs off the copper network, we need to actually give them an economic incentive to get there until the applications are proven where they can actually charge a premium to their customer. So a little bit on product and pricing. Basically, as I said, the The telephony DSL resale product's about 55 New Zealand dollars. The naked ADSL product's 45 New Zealand dollars. So we set the entry-level fibre product, we actually down-rated it a little bit at 30/10 megabits per second with a very high committed information rate. So that's a guaranteed bandwidth of 2.5 megabits per second. We actually wanted to set that higher, but the operators complained that it had put too much switch gear in. And that's at 3750. So the strategy really was to encourage the RSPs to migrate to a superior fibre product at a lower price, and then to upsell their customers, and bandwidth actually came into the higher spec product at a residential layer, which is 100/50 megabits per second, which is a full triple play enabled product at about $55. So that's the current cost that they actually have as an input cost for their retail services. So about 90% of the services that a retail service provider has in New Zealand are actually through the telephony and the ADSL resale product. 4 Ethernet ports for the residential ONT, plus 2 voice. We also wanted to put a Wi-Fi port on there, encouraging the RSPs that didn't have to put a residential gateway in, so they can actually use the ONT as the gateway, and they can actually manage the virtual ports on that as well. Double tagging, so we can have multiple VLANs going into the same port, into the same premise. Point-to-point prices, unlike the US, our central metro or metropolitan access network fibre prices were very high, predominantly again a function of the incumbent who had a lot of copper out there. They wanted to keep the revenue on the copper, and when they deployed the fibre, they largely deployed it down the middle of the street, so connection costs were still very high, and we wanted to address that issue as well. What we're sort of dealing with in terms of size, New Zealand's a little bit bigger than the UK, or about the same size as Colorado, but clearly surrounded by water. As I said, Auckland's about the same size as Philadelphia. The interesting thing to note here is the urban density. Most New Zealanders live on at least a quarter acre, half acre lot. Most people have a swimming pool, a large lawn. So we have large street frontages, 18 to 20 yards is an average street frontage. Only 5% of the population live in a multiple dwelling unit or an apartment. Christchurch, which obviously had the large earthquake just recently, density there is even much less because it actually brought backs into large farming areas. It's about similar size to Oakland, but you can see the urban density there, so that's a real issue for us in relation to cost of the network. Population about the same size as Louisiana or Kentucky. And the other thing we focus on in the initiative is priority users. They are defined as education, business and health, and they are all to be covered by 2015. So it's 1.3 million dwellings across the country. What does the government actually fund? And then I'll talk about how we actually fund it. We fund what's traditionally called the last mile, so essentially the optical distribution frame in the central office, running the fibre out to the street, right down the curb and to the private boundary of the property. So we very much wanted to make sure there was no barrier to connect. So a lot of the fibre in the central business districts goes down the middle of the street, and the cost to connect is upwards of $30,000 to open the street, get council, city consent. So we're telling all the operators they have to build to the boundary. Then the partner, they fund all the electronics, backhaul and the lead into the house. So most of their funding initially is around demand based. So the government subsidy effectively works on the basis that we are actually funding the stranded capital if they don't actually get connections to the network. We have a complicated sort of funding structure. This was largely due to how we actually ran our process to get a competitive process actually involved in here. So Crown Fibre Holdings, we're actually investing $1.3 billion. The $1.5 billion was the policy, but we have to put $150 million into schools to actually get them enabled for the broadband, and there's $50 million on actually operational transactional costs around actually setting this up. So on the left, we actually have a structure here where we actually have a joint venture with the partner. Those 3 partners there are local electricity lines distribution companies. So we put our funding in through share capital, tracks no dividends for 10 years, and the partner puts in their capital, which tracks all the dividends in the first 10 years, and that funds the build cost. At the end of 10 years, as a liquidity event, we essentially sell our shares. So if the business has been successful, we'll get a good price for them. If it hasn't been successful, we'll get a low price for them. So it's a de-risk the partner, essentially. The economics of that, it looks like an interest-free loan. Essentially, that's the way to characterise it. Very similar to Korea, but slightly more complicated structure because we have an involvement in the management there. So the business operates more like a private equity firm in that regard. with Chorus, which is actually the access part of Telecom New Zealand, so that's the last mile business unit inside the incumbent. They didn't want to have a joint venture structure for various reasons, so we essentially invested in them through a series of complicated equity and debt notes, which are effectively interest-free, and they repay us at face value over a period of time. Effectively, from an economics perspective, we're indifferent between that. The cost of the network is about 3.5 billion New Zealand dollars. You could probably equate that dollar for dollar on a PPP basis to the US. So if you looked at 75% population coverage in the US, say 100 million homes, to make the maths easy, it's about 187 billion US dollars to actually build a network of this size in the US. Our net subsidy is $600 million, so because we get the funds back, essentially that's our cost of funds of $600 million. So essentially the taxpayer subsidy is the cost of funds. So essentially the partner doesn't actually have to bear that. Hopefully we won't get a capital loss. So if you translated that into the US, and one part of the policy is we're not overbuilding existing fibre because we want to extend fibre, not overbuild it. So if you said you got 75 million homes you wanted to cover in the US, say there's 20 million already of fibre, Verizon has about 16 million, that means your investment would be about 137 billion. That includes connecting the home, so it's about $2,500 a home. So the subsidy would be about, on an equivalent basis, if you did a similar transaction in the US, would be about 27 billion, would be the equivalent subsidy in the US. So the industry will end up as a vertically separated industry, with essentially the incumbent on the left there, which is Chorus, and they will be structurally separated from their retail arm. So they're listed on New York, the Australian Stock Exchange, New Zealand Stock Exchange are our second largest company. That's a demerger transaction which is happening this year. So effectively the shareholder of Telecom New Zealand will have one stock, one in the retail business, including their mobile arm, one in the local access monopoly business, which will look like a typical infrastructure, regulated infrastructure type business. That will have all the copper access and all the fibre access to the extent they've won that in the initiative. So they won about 70% of the country, and then the Electricity Alliance Company won about 30% of the initiative. So we've got enough to keep the balance there, to keep the incumbent honest, because the challenge we have with the incumbent, they've already got customers on their copper network. How are we sure that they'll actually migrate the customers to the fibre network? So we set up a regime of quite stringent SLAs, so if the retail service providers ask them to connect, they have to connect within 4 days, or there's penalty regimes, etc. So it's quite a stringent regime in that regard. And there's the retail service provider layer up there. So essentially the whole market and fixed will all become a CLEC. Exception, Telstra has some local access network, but not a significant amount. The regulatory framework, most of this I've sort of already covered. It's open access, non-discriminatory, enforcement by the Commerce Commission, our version of the FCC, independent commissioners appointed by the government. The operator will enter into a deed of undertaking with the government that they will not breach these undertakings. It's wholesale only, retail prohibition through legislation. Mandatory services being GPON for the mass market and point-to-point for business customers. We went a GPON route essentially for cost, given the large street passings that we actually have. Layer 1, point-to-point only, unbundling of GPON in 2020. Again, we didn't unbundle GPON on day one because of the cost that would imply on the operator. And also our view is probably the more sensible way to unbundle the network is through wavelengths in the future, which we think will emerge in 2020. Supporting all the legacy and existing products. Price caps are actually set through contracts, so the bidders had to bid us a price. We actually ended up setting the price to them and going back to them and then actually re-engineering the cost of the network so they could get a rate of return. We set the initiative around about a 8 to 9% weighted average cost of capital for the monopoly access provider. One thing, this is a busy slide because it could potentially get busy. One thing the policymakers were keen to actually have was not only competition for the home on an open access network, but they had the ability for competition in the home. So potentially a multiple service provider environment within the home, which is reasonably unique. You don't see a lot of that today. Singapore's got the similar model, as has Australia. Singapore's got a small handful of premises at the moment where basically a full open access network in the home as well. UFB, I won't really go through the speeds too much here. You can see Hong Kong Broadband, they launched their 1 gig plan there. Obviously it takes not a lot to download anything there. The UFB initiative beside that, Telstra Clear, Warp, that's their DOCSIS 3 product currently in New Zealand. And ADSL, that's my service at home. One of the things here on the right, which is getting a lot more focus in New Zealand with the earthquake, is remote backup. A lot of people in the earthquake, a lot of businesses didn't have a backup into the cloud or a remote backup, and a lot of residential customers lost like 20 years of digital photo records as a result of the earthquake. Because even though they backed up, it doesn't help when your house actually falls off a cliff or actually collapses. So I actually tried to work out how long it would take me to back up my laptop on my ADSL connection, which is a fibre to the node. It would take me 500 hours, so I could actually go on holiday for 2 weeks and come back, and it still hasn't backed up. So one thing to think about fibre is your upload is actually always sort of missed a lot when people talk about fibre. We actually think that's going to be quite an important feature. And we are actually underway with building. It is a 25,000 kilometres of fibre. We've built 40, so we have actually only just awarded it. It's an 8-year initiative. Priority users built first. It's a mixture of aerial underground. The underground is largely going to be air-blown fibre, which is again a cost issue, so we only put the fibre in and connect it when we need it. Aerially, New Zealand cities actually are very focused on visual pollution given the sort of nature of the country and the tourism industry. So we're actually putting the fibre where the arrow is, actually up in a low voltage corridor. We use this slide a lot when we talk to councils asking them to spot the fibre, because they generally object to it. They've seen photos in the US and other countries of the HFC and the fibre on the networks on the poles, so we wanted to reduce the visual pollution. Key priority segments, most of you will know these. Health, New Zealand has a very advanced health sector like the US. The problem is we've got a distributed population, so we really need to use fibre for remote working and shoring up our regional hospitals with our base hospitals. About 12,000 medical facilities we're looking at connecting in the first 4 years. Education, 5% of our schools are on fibre at the moment, so we're looking at having 50% of those in the first 2 years. Business, we're a high export economy, 40% of GDP export based, lots of small home office businesses, so really focusing heavily on them, and the other real focus now is disaster recovery in the business sector. A rural initiative, a lot of New Zealand's economy, it is a rural based economy largely. We've got a very sophisticated dairy industry in New Zealand. We're about 1/3 of global dairy trade, so it's a big focus. Our dairy farmers do not mind paying for broadband, just that they can't get it, and they do actually want it. So we're focusing on the 93% of rural schools, which is nearly 100% of students, 80% of rural households, which would be greater than or equal to 5 megabits per second. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're actually on a dial-up connection out there, that sounds like a heck of a lot. It's funded, basically what the government's done is we've redirected some of the USO, the Universal Service Obligation subsidies on the industry. Instead of applying it to maintaining the legacy copper network in the rural area, we've applied it to introducing broadband into the rural sector. And there is a little bit of a taxpayer subsidy in there, not a lot. It's about 10% of the initiative is actually taxpayer funded, the rest is funded by the industry. It was awarded to Telecom and Vodafone just recently by the government, so it's a grant scheme. So in summary, the policy, like most central governments in our part of the world, it's focused to drive on the belief you get the ultra-fast broadband out there in 10 years' time, it will be a driver of productivity. It's an open access model, vertical separation, new industry structure, 75% population coverage. The deployments are underway. We have gone for a low wholesale price on the fibre, and we've really utilised the private sector. The government did not want to own this infrastructure. The government seriously believes private sector are the best at running businesses. We're just about to get New Zealand government's announced another round of privatisations in New Zealand, so government in New Zealand is getting out of business, so we really wanted to find an effective way to subsidise the private sector, to essentially accelerating the investment that they'd otherwise make, but might not make it for 10 or 15 years. So that was really the structure, thought around that process.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah.
Yeah, the last one. Yeah. And please, to the other panellists, please come up to the front. So thank you, Graham. That's a whistle-stop tour through what is clearly quite a complex and sophisticated plan. I'll mention I have a personal stake in this. My parents live in Nelson, New Zealand, and I'll admit to some excitement that their ADSL and its attendant monthly caps might be history, and that the shaky connection between their grandson in Washington and them will get a little better. So I'm intrigued by what's going on, but I'm probably not as intrigued as Blair is, being the author or crafter of the US plan. Now, Blair, you probably have thoughts on this, as was discussed. There's some monstrous amount of equivalent investment if you compare it to the US. How do you fancy taking that to the White House?
I think not. I think it might be best if I didn't do that. No, if we had come to them and said our plan calls for $100 billion or 137 billion, though actually I think your last comment was really the subsidy is really only 27 billion. Yeah. Let's put that number aside for a second. I think we would have been laughed out of the White House, or that would have been the polite thing that they might have done to us. But the bigger point that I want to make is that the achievement that they will accomplish, in some sense, we're going to achieve without expending any government dollars. That is to say, by virtue of the fact that we have a cable industry that covers about 92% of the homes, and that they're going to upgrade to DOCSIS 3 in basically all of those homes, that gives you 100 megs down. The upload is still a little bit uncertain, and that's not it's not where we ultimately want to be, I don't think, though I don't know what the word ultimately means. It depends on your time frame. But the point is, not only would there not be the 100 billion, you couldn't justify it on the basis of kind of the incremental benefit if what you perceive as the benefit is that kind of speed. So I think the first thing, and since I've finished up at the U.S., I've talked to a number of different countries, and one size doesn't fit all. You have to start with where you are. And one of the big points that we started with is there's a really big fact, which is that we have 2 wires going into more than 90% of the homes. I think only Canada is kind of equivalent. And so that's really the big point, is not so much the money, though, as we always say, it's not the money, but the money, it is the money. But it's really more to the point that to achieve that thing, we don't need any government money. If that's what you think of the thing. Two other quick points. Number one, there are some who criticize us for not doing something like an open access model, who articulated that we should have done precisely that, even without spending more government money. Putting aside a number of legal problems with that and a number of political problems with that, our thought was that it was actually bad policy, because if you had such an open access regime grafted onto the current competitive regime, what you would have basically done is, for all of those telcos who have an inferior plan to cable, they simply would have then glommed onto the cable, and we wouldn't have seen the upgrade in that telco plan. So you could see, for example, AT&T just not upgrading their UVerse and instead just going on to cable, and I don't think that would have actually been good for the United States. And the final point is, it was interesting, I'm not sure I quite understood the economics of how you got to the 27, but that's actually a much more reasonable number, and certainly when we look at kind of the rural build-out, we're spending over any kind of period of time, we spend $4.5 billion a year on high-cost subsidies to rural residential areas, and over time, that's an equivalent number. And we ought to be able to, and indeed we put out a plan that without raising the high-cost fund, to do something similar, though not at the same speeds, but it wasn't clear to me that you're going to get the same speeds in rural areas. I think you said getting 5.
Yeah, that's the grants. Yeah.
Right, and we put it at 4 for various reasons I'm happy to go into. But that was my thought, other than that if I had been in charge of the New Zealand broadband plan, we definitely would have brought in Peter Jackson to do a video, because like the visuals of New Zealand are so great.
Thank you, Blair. And I apologize for not introducing Blair as a fellow at the Communications and Society program, and clearly thinks about society and culture as broadly than just communication. Before I turn to Ben, I just want to go back to Graham. So we're getting what, in some way, Blair's argued, what is costing you a lot of money for free. And Blair's argued the DOCSIS 3 upgrade of the cable system gives us that. You didn't go down that path. You didn't rely on Telstra and that path why didn't you? I just want a specific question.
Well, the issue is there is no last mile competition other than in a very small sector of New Zealand. So you end up with the regulatory economic problem of there's no incentive to innovate for the incumbent monopolist, right, which clearly was the case. So the previous government actually intervened through fibre to the node. So that chart which showed broadband connections, New Zealand was nearly off the OECD chart at one stage because of that. Because there is no incentive unless they view they can get more revenue, so they don't innovate. Right. The difference that you have here, and you could see it with the Verizon Fios, which people wonder about their rate of return, but they clearly invested as that as a competitive response. Cable here in the US, it's reasonably unusual that the cable market here, or the MSOs, have a greater share of broadband as opposed to the RBOC, because you've got that competitive tension there. DOCSIS 3, DOCSIS 4, you do get some of those speeds. They are still shared by a node. So, but the cable operator probably has more incentive to push fibre deeper into his network because it's easier for them to do. I think the interesting thing is here going to be is how will the RBOC respond, because I think the cable operator can upgrade their speeds easier. With DOCSIS 4 pushing fibre, from a node to the curb, and then using coax, which is a good last mile, good 100 metre, 100 yard technology. And then what will the RBOC do? It's very expensive to deploy fibre. That's why we actually had to put the subsidy in there. And here you've got the issue that if you do deploy a new network, you're not going to get all the customers yourself. That's why we had to go to an open access model, because you want as many customers on the network as you possibly can once you've built the network. But if you're vertically integrated, like the RBOC are here, at the best you can hope for is 50% market share in a duopoly. And it's not quite a duopoly because you've got the direct-to-home satellite and wireless as well, so you already take 20% off. So you're probably at best going to get 40%, and you're starting behind the other guy. So it's a different market structure, I think, that drives that.
Great. No, and so turn to Ben. You work in policy with us at the Open Technology Initiative. You followed, and we've made representations to Blair in his old role, and explored other models across the world. Your thoughts on New Zealand and pros and cons of the path they're going on?
Well, I think it's sort of the path that they had to take based on the monopoly structure that they had in place. I will quibble with Blair a little bit on the state of competition in the U.S., which and whether or not cable is actually equivalent to what they're actually doing in New Zealand. The path we've chosen is that, instead of focusing on one major infrastructure and then doing an open access from that and facilitating competition, we have sort of this cable telephone duopoly. Whether that's worked out well for us is pretty highly debatable. I mean, we have a structure right now where cable is virtually the speed monopoly in a lot of communities. Fios has not been deployed all over the country in very sort of densely populated urban areas and wealthy suburbs. And the wireless side, which was sort of predicted to be this third pipe, is owned by the same companies that own the telephone company as well. And so what you're seeing is, yes, we've seen some substantial upgrades by the cable companies for DOCSIS 3, all of which was a pretty incremental cost for them. I mean, you're talking about upgrading equipment on the edges of the network, not a substantial investment in your actual infrastructure. And then, some marginal improvements from AT&T to deliver UVerse, but generally their speeds have been actually increased very little, and they're still charging around the same rate. And then on top, you layer on top of that, which is this sort of increasing reliance on broadband, on caps, bandwidth caps. So not only on one hand, we sort of see an increase in speeds, but you're actually seeing, an effort by the cable companies and even AT&T now of instituting not just caps on their mobile service, but caps on their DSL service, all of which sort of diminishes the utility of the service. So, do I think that we should be following exactly what New Zealand is doing in the U.S.? Probably not, but I think what's interesting is we're not doing necessarily what New Zealand is doing on a national level, but you're seeing in cities across the country where they don't have sufficient access to broadband, local municipalities building their own networks. Many of them are not open access. I mean, I think there's one open access network in Utah Utopia, which is following a very similar model. But that's where you're seeing the innovation and the very high speeds at very affordable prices, not necessarily in the private sector for residential users.
Okay, thanks. And so turning to Joanne Hovis, you work at the municipal level and about Columbia Telecommunications. I hate to do this, but are we heading towards utopia? Do you have any reflections on the New Zealand plan?
I do. Maybe my so reflections on the New Zealand plan. It's always very tempting to respond to Blair rather than responding to the big picture. I think we all fall into that because so much of what he says is so challenging and important. I would say that big picture on the New Zealand plan. The thing that always strikes me when I think about it is the completely different political framework in which they are having a debate about broadband, and that this project is an initiative of a center-right government. I'd be really interested to know what the response of the center-left government is to it and where one goes from there. And that so much of what they discuss, and that is just second nature for Graham to discuss and talk about, and the language he uses is language we can't even bring up in polite society in the United States. In Washington, we don't talk about things like open access and unbundling. We get nervous these days even talking about non-discrimination, but certainly the idea of the structural separation and the lack of integration that he described as a conversation one couldn't even have. So they clearly have a very different framework for discussing communications, and whatever the outcome in the United States, and I agreed with huge parts of the National Broadband Plan, but whatever the outcome, I wish we were having that conversation, and a lot of it we really were never having. There were conversations that we just never had the option of raising, and that's not anybody's fault. That's something about where we are politically in the United States. On a much smaller level, another thought I had as I was listening to Graham speak, and this speaks to my municipal and local and state experience. One of the sort of intriguing things, I think, is the emphasis on access and localism, that they didn't do a blanket contract for the entire country of New Zealand for one operator who would then own the fiber throughout the country, that there were parts of the country where they contracted with the local utilities, the power utilities, and that there was a certain opportunity there for localism, including how the ISPs, the RSPs, would be able to compete over the network, and I see Dr. Rod Wansade from the Small Business Administration is here, but one of the other topics that is particularly interesting about this is not just how a network like this enables small business, which is one of the areas of their focus in terms of small business consumers, but also how it enables small business providers by making that platform available. And of course, we don't really have that in a meaningful way in the United States anymore at all in terms of small business participation in this market. And that was something that really struck me. And there, I think, is where I would have the biggest bone of contention with the idea that cable is going to solve all these problems for us, because the cable footprint is not ubiquitous in small business areas. It's certainly not at 92%. And we have DSL issues and failures in many urban small business areas, excuse me, because the networks are simply tapped out or aren't capable of what they're doing. So in major American cities, in urban and inner suburban areas, small businesses don't have the option of any broadband other than wireless, which doesn't really support a small business. And that's one of the things that kind of struck me about the combination of your comments.
Great, thanks. I'll turn first to Graham, but perhaps afterwards Blair, because I think you may want to respond. So you've got a centre-right government led by an investment banker, or trader even, with a dialogue and such a significant investment that we couldn't it's difficult for us to comprehend it here. Can you explain how that has emerged and is able to happen?
Yeah.
And I'll also just give you a follow-up on, I'm aware that the Labour Party and Claire Curran in particular, has made issue with this plan, and I know that there are they've been significantly, it's been controversial for them, and they've I think recommended or planned on raising the structural separation penalty to potentially 100 million from 10 million if they get elected. Explain the political dynamics and the dialogue that's gone on in the country. I think it's really interesting for us here.
Yeah, well, I think we have to put the UFB investment by the government, or the subsidies we call it, because it's not a grant, it is a subsidy, in the context with what else the central government's doing. So, for example, we're upgrading the freeway system in Auckland. That's $1.5 billion to $2 billion New Zealand dollars by way of comparison, and we don't get any money back. Well, hopefully we get productivity benefits back. The earthquake in Christchurch, central government's actually investing $6 billion New Zealand dollars, which is 2 to 3% of GDP to reconstruct the city, because we've lost 40 blocks of the CBD. So it is a large investment, but it's not. It's in context of a complete infrastructure plan that the central government is doing. We're reasonably fortunate that New Zealand has had 20 years of government surplus. So our debt levels before the global financial crisis were around 20% of GDP, or a bit less. So the central government has made a decision that we will lift that up to about 30-odd%. Obviously, the earthquake would have meant that it would have been below 30. If we didn't have the earthquake, we would have been below 30 to actually invest in the core infrastructure to actually lift GDP. Because New Zealand's had this interesting dynamic that in the 1950s it had the second highest GDP per capita in the world, and now we're something like the 20th. And that's around economic growth, and a lot of it's around infrastructure and the economy. The political dynamic is that the challenge that the opposition has in New Zealand, which is a Labour opposition I should say, and there's a Labour government in Australia which is embarking on a much more grandiose scheme. It's $42 billion or about $45 billion US, and they're going to build it and operate it themselves. There's a lot of the core principles why you do these things it's hard for a socialist-leaning party to object to, which is improved healthcare, improved education, improved services to your citizens and your disadvantaged groups, improving small business productivity to create jobs in the economy, and you're actually doing some intervention, which socialist governments are more inclined to do than right-wing governments. And the interesting thing is the Minister of Communications is actually a multi-millionaire himself, a very successful man who sold radio stations. So it's an interesting thing, but the sort of more business-leaning central government decided is if we don't actually do this, we won't get the infrastructure in place. So the opposition has had struggled to actually find holes in the policy to try to argue about how we implement it and things like that, but we're not actually seeing it's not going to become an election issue in this upcoming election, because most of the general public, if you go out there and they say, do you want ultra-fast broadband, people will say yes. They don't understand the complexities of the subsidy or how that works, and the subsidy isn't that large at the end of the day. They actually think we're spending 1.5 billion, not 600 million. So if we told them we're spending 600 million, which we have, and somebody actually registered that, they'll say, well, geez, that's good. So it does lead to a problem. The far-right government, the far-right party in Parliament actually objected to it. So it's a coalition government, so the Maori Party, which is an Indigenous party, actually joined the government and actually voting the legislation through. And we have to liaise with them to create economic growth and broadband in relation to where they have their, what we call maraes, their meeting areas and their Indigenous areas. They're about 15% of New Zealand population, so they're quite a sizable group.
Great. Blair, you...
Sure. Let me just say a couple quick things. I think it's important in the ongoing conversation to always be clear about where the agreements are, but also where the differences are. One difference between Ben and I is he's defined market as a technical parameter, speed. Cable is a speed monopolist. I just disagree. I'm much more traditional in my antitrust analysis. It's defined by consumer behavior. And if you look at actual consumer behavior, cable is not a monopolist where they have an advantage, much like there are certain advantages of a Camry over an Accord, but they compete with each other, and they compete in price, they compete in brand, they compete in a number of things. There may be a time in the future where my analysis has changed because consumer behavior changes. That is, if there are applications that require greater speeds, that very much could change. And then the question will be, and that's the question that Graham asked, which is how do the RBOCs respond? And I don't know the answer to that. Second thing is, Ben's absolutely right that wireless is owned by or dominated by people who own wireline companies, but the geographic footprint is very different. And we think that's a significant thing. We don't know whether wireless broadband will actually compete with wired broadband, but in a significant amount of the country, the wireless offering will compete with the wired phone offering in terms of functionality. Some very interesting potential dynamics there as we move to 4G. We were pretty humble in what we knew and what we knew we didn't know. But that'll be interesting to see what the actual strategy, whether AT&T and Verizon and Sprint actually try to go after kind of the DSL customers. And again, how do the phone companies react? I don't think it's a bigger problem. I don't think it's a big problem for cable. One thing I think we all agree on is actually that local governments should have the ability to do their own efforts if they see it as necessary as a safety valve. One can argue about whether a particular local government should do it, but we certainly argue for that right. I might say that since the plan came out with that point of view, there's been a little backward movement in some states, but that's unfortunate. And finally, going to Joanne's point, which I think she meant somewhat tongue-in-cheek about the nature of the conversations, or I should say, I mean this tongue-in-cheek. We discussed everything in the broadband plan, but there certainly is a difference in the political mood from when we started the broadband plan, in which one could articulate the importance of certain investments. And indeed, there were a couple of things that we thought that we should invest in, such as the public safety network. But, we are now in a political conversation that is fundamentally focused on how do you simply remove government funding from things. That is what the conversation is about. In my view, it's unfortunate that the conversation is that's where it goes. I think that, you guys looked very clearly at where there was an opportunity and where there's a need for government to make certain investments. And over the years, our government has invested in certain things, whether it be highways in the 50s or, the internet in the 70s that have I think, paid off. But there are certain places where I think greater government investment, and you talk about schools and healthcare facilities, we certainly saw the same thing, that those are places where the government, as the largest buyer of those services, should invest in a very effective manner, both on the application side and the network side, to improve the delivery of those services. And big networks are a part of it. And one of the things that I fear that we are missing is that the incremental benefit of much higher speeds to educational institutions is so much greater than the incremental benefit of higher speeds to rural homes. And yet we're going to, if I was an analyst, I would predict that we will continue to spend significantly more on connecting rural homes and upgrading their speeds, whereas we're missing a big opportunity with education.
Right, thanks. And so just taking, Graham, the plan as a given, and it will be implemented, it will be successful, people will get their broadband. This is a $600 million subsidy to these companies. In terms of it sort of, and I noticed that one of the investment banks has rated New Zealand telecom shares up in the last couple of days. They seem pretty happy. And I'm just thinking about this in terms of government subsidies and international trade and trade negotiations. How do you see that playing out there? Because the US and New Zealand are in a trade negotiation, and questions of subsidies to industries are part of that, I think.
Yeah, well, I think every central government does subsidies to some industry sector. There's lots of subsidies here in the US which we would object to, and for example, in the agricultural sector where we're very global competitive leaders. So and you've got Singapore, you've got Australia. There's a number of people actually doing that out there. The issue with Telecom New Zealand and their share price, we actually think their share price going up is a good thing, because we think growth in private capital is a good thing, not a bad thing. Arguably, if they hadn't got it, you could actually try and work out what the counterfactual to that might have been. We're not in that position. The issue that they had, there was a large regulatory overhang on their stock. There's a lot of regulatory uncertainty about what was happening with them if they didn't actually were awarded initiative. You can imagine, being an incumbent telco waking up in 10 years' time and somebody with some assistance of the central government's overbuild 100% of your network with fibre and your network's copper, that's not going to be a good thing. So I think it's taken a lot of certainty. If you look at how they're measured against their benchmarks, they're now starting, they were way below their benchmarks on EBITDAs and now creeping back up to where they probably should have been. So I think it's a lot of that overhang. It's not so much, the subsidy certainly hasn't done it because the prices that we've actually set are below their copper prices. So if you think they're getting a return on capital on their copper prices, you can actually see we've actually effectively taken the rents out of the pricing structure of the fibre product, so they're not getting an excess rent. Okay. If they do, we actually have warrants on their stock, so we gain the upside, so we actually get the warrants. There. So,
right. Well, this is an interesting plan, and I know we've got some people in the audience, so I'm sure have some questions. So Jason at the back has the mic. The gentleman in the green shirt, just here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Andrew Afflerbach, and actually I was privileged to work with Graham and John, assisting with the architecture and some of the procurement and design of the ultra-fast broadband network. As part of that, I've had the opportunity to travel to Singapore, Malaysia, and to Verizon's labs here as well, and spend a good amount of time with a number of deployers, manufacturers, and people involved with fiber optic rollout. What's amazing to me is that if you look at China, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Japan, and you look at the parts of the United States that have this fiber optic and the ability, without adding a single bit of additional outside plant, to upgrade electronics, sometimes just push software code and go to 10 gig. I understand that most of us can't fill some of the pipes that we have right now coming to us, but I have to say, just as somebody in the United States where if we're relying on cable and the idea of incremental build, a competent, good, but not great network, I have to say it doesn't give me a very warm feeling going forward that this is what we're working with for the foreseeable future when China and other companies are going to be moving much further ahead and will be able to make enormous leaps.
Great. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Didn't hear a question there, Andrew, but it's a comment as well. We were small. Constantine at the front here.
Hi, thank you. I'm Constantine. I'm a fellow here. I'm not a broadband person, unlike many of you in the room. So I hope you'll forgive both the tenor and the sort of implied ignorance in my question. But as those of you who've been in the U.S. know, in Los Angeles, this highway was closed for a couple of days this weekend. And there's been a lot of discussion around that, of the discussion of building capacity in highways that just drives further traffic. And that immediately comes to mind with me with broadband. I mean, as a user, I love a sort of faster internet connection as much as the next guy. But and I can certainly see in specific applications, as you mentioned, in education, particularly in medical applications, an immediate sort of increase in productivity. But I also wonder, talking about triple play, talking about these things, the question of, okay, we can stream HD video rather than 640 by 480 video. If your ultimate goal is an increase in productivity, which I understand is the goal of the program, and this goes to New Zealand as well as to the States, I guess. What I'm curious is, and this isn't getting into the details of how the deal is structured, but the question of whether spending what amounts to a very large amount of money as a percentage of GDP, as Tom pointed out, is a sort of cost-effective way to increase productivity, or whether you're just going to sort of, by adding capacity, increase demand for broadband and sort of appear that you're using it while not. I don't know. It's not entirely well posed, but.
Great. Pen, do you want to? Or Graham?
Yeah, it's a question that's raised a lot by particularly people under the industry, and particularly people are wondering, will the end result of the network just be a lot more YouTube, for example? Right. And some people do argue that YouTube adds to productivity. You can form a view on that, a personal view on that, rather than a professional view on that. I think how we see it is obviously it's easy to justify the case around education, connecting schools, connecting medical facilities, connecting business, things like that. Cloud computing, connecting home business. But when
right? Why most businesses don't necessarily need a gigabit per second.
No, not most businesses do. That's correct. But a small enterprise will need to be able to back up their files as they did in Christchurch. And the problem in Christchurch, there's a great photo in the newspaper there of a small business owner walking down the street, and the strap line is backup Christchurch style, and he's carrying 2 servers under his arm covered in dust. So the ability for a small business owner to back up his customer files to the cloud is turned out to be crucially important in Christchurch now. A lot of these businesses have actually gone out of business, not because they can't relocate, they just can't even build a customer because they're not in the cloud. The broadband connectivity doesn't enable them to get into the cloud. So I think it is very important for small enterprise. And in New Zealand, a 5-person business is actually an exporter in New Zealand because our market's so small, we have to export. There's such a large portion of the population. The thing is, when you go into the residential market, what we see is people in a residential home, a typical family home, if you think about telecommunications, spend money to communicate with people, spend money on entertainment, and they will spend money on their children. So we actually see the entertainment offering into the home as a Trojan horse, really to flow through the education application. So the student, when they're actually at home, can actually start to learn and interact with their classmates virtually or remotely into the school. So, and that's a way to actually get that service into the home. And also remote health is actually increasingly becoming an issue as the baby boomers go like that. And also, so for example, Christchurch, Genai, which is one of our largest IT companies in New Zealand, they said, this is great, when we get the fibre deployed, we're actually going to have all the call centres backed up in the homes. And so how's that going to work? They said 150 call centre agents, we lost a call centre, we'll be able to actually have them auto-operate from the residential home as a call centre with the high speed, basically wide area network connectivity into the home at 10 to 100, because your average local area network in your office is 100 megabits per second. So you need that sort of connectivity to assume there's no latency on the application. So there's things like that. It's sort of thinking outside the box, I think, a lot more of where you see the productivity coming into the home. You talked about the 405 being closed. I was in LA when that actually happened, and it's a great story that a cyclist actually bet the aeroplane flying from Long Beach to Burbank. At the even in a city of Auckland, which, we do have traffic problems, and it can be an hour and a half commute even in a city of that size. And we can't keep on building freeways because we don't really have enough money to build an integrated public transport infrastructure. So time-shifting workers, by having the remote applications in their home, will actually gain productivity, not spending an hour and a half in a motor vehicle. They might even spend half an hour in a motor vehicle. And there's been a number of studies. Cisco's done a large study on that in San Jose about remote working. In New Zealand, the Cisco CEO I know very well. There's at least 10 Cisco executives who work and live in New Zealand, but don't actually work for him. They work for people in San Jose. But with higher speed broadband, they can actually interact effectively. So there's things like that. But obviously people think about entertainment first because that's the most obvious thing, and that's the sizzle that you sell. But we see it as at a central government, we see it as a Trojan horse to bring the other productivity benefits in.
If I could offer 2 quick observations. First, I'm basically for the private sector driving the supply based on their perception of the demand. I think there are 2 places where we have to, where the government might think about interventions. One is where, by virtue of the private sector driving it, you actually, as a matter of social justice or some other societal goal, you have to act. If 80% of school children are now primarily using the internet for homework, what does it mean for the other 20% who don't have it? So that's one place, or healthcare delivery, et cetera. So that gets driven by the use case, and that would be my second point. That one of the problems we saw with the way government policy works is it's based on the paradigm and the thinking of the analog phone or the multi-channel video cable provider, where one size fits all. You get an analog dial tone anywhere, you have to offer it everywhere, same price. In the world of bandwidth, it's got to be more use-cased. I think we make a big mistake, and it's driven by certain companies who have a stake in this, to think that if we get a gigabit anywhere, we have to suddenly get it everywhere. The doctor who's looking at MRIs might need it, but that doesn't mean that the farmer does. So we've got to be more sophisticated and thoughtful about what we choose to subsidize. And it should be places that either are about kind of that market failure that I talked about, or about technological leadership. And I think it's very concerning. I would say the United States leads in a lot of different categories, not in adoption and not in speeds, but in some others, but that are important. but that the reason we do is because of very abundant computing resources we had in the 70s and 80s, and so a whole generation grew up knowing how to exploit that, and that we may not have that in the future. So, you know, what Google is doing with the fiber initiative in Kansas City, I think, is extremely important, but I think we need to do more things like that which drive it at the top. The goal actually is not necessarily productivity gains are hopefully will come out of it, but I think we got to think of the goal as a ubiquitous, diverse, and constantly improving broadband ecosystem, because that will deliver both the economic gains but also the social gains that we need.
Ben or Joanne, any comments on the case for broadband? And Blair's mentioned it's somewhat driven by industry interests in they have the technology to sell, so why not push that as the standard? Any thoughts on how the case for these sort of investments that are going on in New Zealand?
Well, I don't think, you know, we keep getting in this sort of chicken and egg argument, which is, you know, if we build a big pipe, you know, what will be filled with it, or you can't have a big pipe, you can't have these great services unless you have a big pipe. I mean, the reality is, like, we don't really know exactly what the benefits are. We have sort of great things that could be happening. You know, we have things like telehealth, we have things like teleeducation, we have all of these, you know, sort of particular uses for, you know, smart grid and all these other sort of things that we could be moving data better to people, to businesses, from hospitals, from schools. You know, right now, I mean, clearly the benefit is, I think, in education, healthcare, and getting them really big broadband. There's some interesting things, for example, a network in Santa Monica, where they've used it to big, very, very high-speed broadband to connect the studios there, because they were incurred a lot of huge costs for transferring movies from them to editors and back and forth, and they've, you know, sort of, it's been a huge economic development boon for them. I tend to sort of think if you build the pipe, it will be filled, and it will be filled with a mix of, like we have now, which is entertainment, and then also extremely beneficial uses, including access to information, all the sort of things that are happening once you sort of open up a little bit more of a mobile framework in terms of healthcare services and some interesting applications there. But, you know, I think the decision we've made in the U.S. is that we are not going to sort of invest in infrastructure that is necessarily upgradable for the future. And I don't know where that's going to lead us, to be perfectly honest.
I will, it just seems to me, to come back to your question, that when we're talking about what is increasingly the foundational platform of our economy and our democracy, the sort of question of if we have more of it, will we really use it, is a pretty risky question. And the question I wish we were engaging much more is, why is it that the rest of the world, or at least the countries we compete with, are doing something we're not doing? Which is exactly what Ben just said. They're building something that is future-proof and upgradable, and we're not. We're relying on something that was designed and built in the 1970s and was as good as it got in the 1970s, and nobody else almost in the world had it. That's cable. But assuming that that takes us all the way is pretty worrying. Whether we'll use capacity, that I don't doubt for a minute. And even if a lot of that is junk, I'm not in the business of opining on what's good and what's junk. It's pretty central, it's foundational, and in some cases, it's absolutely transformative. For a small business to have a reliable, high-speed connection and to be able to upload things to the cloud that you might have had to host yourself and try to provide services yourself, try to host servers, try to do things that are outside your skill set, and to be able to do it now in this relatively inexpensive way because bandwidth has made it possible, that's pretty transformative. That changes the economics of a number of different areas for a small business, and I speak from personal experience. And that's not something that is easily attainable, and I speak from personal experience there too, and my small business is right here just outside the Washington Beltway. If I can't get it, who can? So my personal experience is that we migrate our uses to bigger bandwidth. And I'd hate to see us hit a very big wall at some point in the future and realize that we weren't looking at the right examples when we should have been.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. And I'll take a final two questions from these two gentlemen here. I think one has come from the Small Business Administration. So we're...
Thank you. Ben, I noticed that you mentioned entertainment briefly, but most of the applications that you addressed towards the bandwidth was education and health. Point. Thank you for finally realizing that the transportation infrastructure can only be built out so far, and we need to take a look at work as an alternative. My name is Chuck Wilsker. I'm the president of the Telework Coalition, and I appreciate that you finally, it seemed like almost as an afterthought after education and health, but mentioned that work is a huge driver of bandwidth. And the number of people that are doing it more and more with more of the applications, with price of gasoline and so forth, more and more people are saying, I can't afford to drive to work anymore. So my question is, Ben, you didn't mention work. Do you see this as also as an application that has some merit in this?
Yeah, I didn't mention it, but yes. I mean, and I think what you're seeing, though, is that the network infrastructure we have right now is not necessarily supportive of that concept. So we have issues with the federal government trying to figure out ways to prioritize federal users at home during emergencies because they're so worried about the actual infrastructure as it is now. You also have an issue that just came out of an independent consultant that does a lot of media-related stuff who was on Comcast network as a residential user. He can't get a business class line because he's not considered a business, where he exceeded the Comcast cap, because he was using a lot of cloud-based applications, and his service was terminated. So, the potential is certainly there, and it's been there forever. I mean, we've been hearing about sort of the internet and broadband sort of transforming work for a very long time. My question is, like, what has been the sort of inhibitor of that? And I think it's been the capacity of the network. It's been the speeds. And I think fiber, the sort of big broadband, ultra-fast broadband sort of opens the door for that. I'm not sure we get there with the current.
Well, I do think it goes to what Joanne said, is that we need to build for the future. We can't, we need to look ahead.
Great, thank you, sir. Just quickly on caps, Graham, are they going away?
Yeah, we do have a challenge in New Zealand. And, as you saw on the slide, we're 6,500 miles away from the US backbone, where most of the internet traffic goes. So when you move into an ultra-fast broadband environment, it's a misconception that people are going to surf the internet at 100 megabits per second, because your computer just doesn't go that fast. You're not using 100 megabits on the international gateway, you're using it locally. So, and a lot of the market structure in New Zealand, because as you saw, it's a retail minus X, the retail service providers make their money out of selling data caps. So we have quite low data caps, some as low as 10 gigabits. Which means basically you download Avatar, you've blown 150% of your data, and that's how they've been making money. So, but while Australia, which is even further from the US, but it's got an Asian cable network, they're at a terabit data caps now. So we do see them changing. That's one of the reasons why we went for a large points of interconnects in the cities, trying to get the traffic within the metropolitan areas zero rated, and between the large metropolitan areas zero rated. And hopefully that will improve a lot of the data cap issues. It is still an issue. You've seen them being reintroduced here with Netflix, obviously, as a driver for data caps being reintroduced into this market here. So there is going to be some form of data cap, but obviously 10 gigs too low, and lots of people over here will probably argue 250 gigabits is too low if you're streaming movies, which it probably is as well. But there has to be some management on the network, but it's fundamentally a fixed cost. Once you've built the network, the access network's fixed. The ports on the switches are fixed. It's only a little bit of the pairing where you're actually at a variable cost layer. Okay. But you do have to manage your so-called vampire on your network who takes all your network resource. And, AT&T clearly saw that with the iPhone.
Yeah, I mean, from past experience, with the ultra-fast broadband speed, you can hit that cap in seconds, if not minutes.
They will lift the caps. There's no two ways about that.
So, final question from the gentleman from the Small Business Administration.
Thank you. I'm Rod Wonsade from the Office of Advocacy at the Small Business Administration, and Joanne, thank you. From all the studies that we've done and seen, cable is a potent monopolist only in the areas where it is. In urban areas where more small businesses are, there's only one alternative. And the more rural the area is, there's just one alternative. It's the incumbent. the question that I have is, in your comments about New Zealand, I sense a strong public interest sense to the infrastructure investments and to the whole effort. It appears that the public interest discussion that we have here, we're having it for the U.S. with a hand tied behind our back, because we're accommodating somebody. We're accommodating the incumbents.
Can I just respectfully disagree? I think the conversation we're having is one that's appropriate for the United States. For example, in the next 10 years, the big upside, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of folks, will not be on the wired network, but will be, or actually it's next 5 years really, will be on the upgrade to wireless. And so the discussion about how do we make sure that 4G gets to everyone is in fact a very important discussion. And that's not about protecting incumbents, that's about economic growth, and it's about social justice. Secondly, the discussion we had, which filled about half the plan, really focused on applications. Again, I think that's the low-lying fruit. And there's just, you know, everybody uses the example of Korea having a gigabit. That's interesting, but here's something that's far more important that nobody noticed. Korea is ending all textbooks in the year 2015. They're moving all to electronic books. That is such a profound and powerful change in how we educate. E-books are so much better than textbooks for a variety of reasons I won't go into, but my point is there's huge upside in that kind of thing. So that's actually a more important debate. I guess I would just simply say in response to your questions and Ben and John is, I mean, the question of are we relying too much on cable, at one point a very distinguished academic came to me and said, Blair, from what I can tell, you're relying way too much on cable. You cannot condemn the United States to a high-end speed of 5 gigabits. And I just looked at him and I said, you know what? That's for the next guy who leads a team to write the national broadband plan. All right? I mean, 5 gigabits, that sounds really great to me. And I do think that we have to look at these things over a certain kind of period of time. And over the next period of time, I think wireless is really important. I think applications are really important. And I do think we need a critical mass of gigabit connected communities. And it's that ecosystem which is really going to drive things. And we get that right, then I think we'll be okay.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate what you did with the National Broadband Plan. I really do. When you look at your Chapter 4 in the National Broadband Plan that dealt with the competition,
mm-hmm. What's your proposal?
My proposal?
Yeah.
What they did.
But that means buying out both the cable and the telco industry.
Open up the system. Let it be a wholesale system, and then.
But which system? The cable
the
and
incumbents, the incumbent system.
Both of them.
Local incumbents that have the last mile access.
Okay, so you'd let AT&T ride over Comcast pipe. You'd let AT&T
no,
just
Blair,
let their.
hold on.
Okay.
Let's talk about Verizon.
Let's talk about Verizon
in this area.
Okay.
The infrastructure that Verizon rides on, if it's split into transport infrastructure,
mm-hmm.
and on top of it is the Verizon higher services, just as anybody else's higher services, just as they're going to have over there.
Yeah.
It's going to work. But unfortunately, we're having the discussion here. We can't have that discussion here. They had it in New Zealand. They had different realities in New Zealand. I know that we can't have that discussion here.
No, we can have the discussion. We had that discussion. We had it very actively at the commission, if people actually recall history correctly.
But
we thought that there is no place in the world. Well, Canada's actually, what they're doing is kind of interesting. But our point was, if you're talking about unbundling, you're talking about unbundling both cable and the telcos, right?
That's fine. That's
well,
fine.
You say it's fine.
You see, but you have cable, the Cable X decision that told you couldn't touch cable.
Okay, so I think we've already gone beyond time here.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to call for some final comments. I know Joanne, you've got one. If Graham or Ben or Blair would like to comment further.
I guess my last thought, having to do with the conversation we're having in the United States, is that it's very challenging when we're talking about an infrastructure where the great benefits have to do with productivity and telework and lifestyle changes and work transformation and healthcare and so on, education. None of the quantifiable benefits of any of that ever show up on the financial statement of the private sector that drives a lot of our planning here, and really in the same way are not quantifiable in meaningful ways for most consumers, for many consumers, although one or more of those may make a big difference for them and drive consumer choices. But their consumer choices are based on what they have. So the benefits that are really what make all of this important and worthwhile and something other than an entertainment medium are not something that we're able to quantify for purposes of decision-making by the private sector or consumers. What do we do about that? We have to have that other way of thinking about things that leads to what is the public role. We disagree about the public role, but I really do think that that foundational idea that there is a public concern and intervention necessary because the public is the only entity that really benefits broadly from so much of what this infrastructure is about, leads us to saying it can't only be private sector driven.
Any other, Graham, closing comments? You've provoked a real discussion here by outlining some alternatives.
One of the interesting things when you're building these networks or doing these initiatives, you don't know where the productivity benefits are going to come from. We can sort of sit there, we can theorise around them, but until you actually see them, and when you've got ubiquitous broadband at this sort of scale, it's hard to actually imagine what 10 years will look like. 10 years ago in New Zealand, I launched flat rate dial-up, and I was regarded, lauded by the industry as a visionary at 42 kilobits per second, and we're now, at 3.6 megabits per second. When we just recently turned the first bit of turf in Hamilton, which is our fourth largest metro outside a small business. They've got 92 employees. They do stainless steel fabrication. They have an office in Bangladesh. They've only got 6 people up there. That's so they can provide 24/7 service to their customers. The biggest problem they have is they do a lot of design fabrication. They have to burn those on a DVD, give it to DHL and courier them up to Bangladesh. He said the problem isn't at the Bangladeshi end. They actually have fibre into their design studio in Bangladesh, and they're on ADSL. And you start to see some of those benefits actually start to happen. And other sorts of things, I think when you get those sorts of things start to happen, you do get real productivity gains in the economy. And then they'll be able to go home and get the designers to work at home as well. So it's those sorts of things, I think, created. And we're a small country. The centre-right government doesn't take intervention lightly. It's not a thing that we generally do, particularly in the circumstance we've had faced New Zealand with a massive earthquake. But they did decide that this was still the largest thing to do. And it was interesting that the Christchurch City Council, which was vastly affected by the earthquake, nearly 200 dead in the city, central business district, 40 blocks is decimated. It looks like the Blitz in London. It really is really bad. They are actually our partner down there, and they actually approved by acclamation 100% around the council, because they thought it was the most important thing they can do to their city to retain their citizens and improve their productivity. So that's the sort of things that are happening that we've seen happening down there.
Well, thank you, Graham. Thank you, Blair, Ben, Joanne. In closing, I'll suggest that we will almost certainly stay in close touch and follow what you're doing down under. For those interested on the web in what we're doing here at New America, oti.newamerica.net, and please join me in thanking our speakers for the rich and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.